The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the pristine marble lobby of Sterling Industries. Rain streaked the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting dancing shadows across the polished stone as thunder rumbled overhead. Sarah Chen clutched her worn portfolio against her chest, her other arm carefully supporting 6-month-old Emma, who had been fussing all morning. The baby's tiny fist gripped Sarah's faded cardigan, the one she'd owned since college and had mended countless times because buying new clothes meant choosing between dinner and keeping the heat on. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's reflection in the elevator's mirrored walls showed a woman trying desperately to look professional despite the odds stacked against her. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, secured with a bobby pin that had lost its grip twice on the subway ride over. Her navy blazer, borrowed from her neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez, hung slightly loose on her small frame. The skirt she wore had been purchased from a thrift store 3 years ago for her last job interview, the one that had led to a position at a small accounting firm that went bankrupt 6 months after Emma was born. The receptionist, a polished woman in her 30s with perfectly applied makeup and a designer suit, looked up from her computer screen with the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. Her gaze swept over Sarah, lingering on the baby, carrier strapped to her chest, and something cold flickered across her expression before the professional mask slipped back into place. "Sarah Chen for the 2 p.m. interview," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. She'd practiced this moment in front of her bathroom mirror while Emma napped, rehearsing how she would present herself as the competent financial analyst she knew she could be. The receptionist's fingers clicked across her keyboard with mechanical precision. "I don't see any notation about accommodations," she said, her eyes pointedly focusing on Emma, who had begun to make soft gurgling sounds. "I called ahead," Sarah replied, shifting Emma's weight slightly. "I spoke with someone in HR last week. They said it would be fine to bring her today. My babysitter canceled this morning due to the flu, and I couldn't reschedule the interview on such short notice." The receptionist's expression remained unchanged, but Sarah caught the subtle eye roll as she reached for her phone. "Let me call upstairs," she said, her tone suggesting this was an enormous inconvenience rather than a simple clarification. Sarah stood in the lobby, watching raindrops race down the windows while elevator music played softly overhead. Other people in expensive suits moved through the space with purpose and confidence, their heels clicking against the marble in a rhythm that spoke of success and security. She wondered if any of them had ever stood where she was standing, wondering if they'd even make it past the lobby. Emma stirred in her carrier, letting out a small whimper that seemed to echo in the vast space. Sarah gently bounced her, humming quietly under her breath, the same lullaby her own mother had sung to her when she was small. It was a melody that carried memories of better times, before her parents died in the car accident that left her alone at 19, before the student loans and the struggle to finish college, while working 3 part-time jobs before Emma's father decided that commitment wasn't for him and disappeared without a forwarding address. "Mr. Davidson will see you now," the receptionist announced, hanging up the phone with a sharp click. 37th floor. The elevator bank is to your right." Sarah nodded her thanks and made her way across the lobby, her second-hand heels making soft sounds against the marble in the elevator. She caught sight of herself again in the mirrored walls and took a deep breath. This was her chance. After months of sending out resumes and getting rejection emails, Sterling Industries had called her back. The position was for a senior financial analyst, exactly the kind of role she'd been working toward before Emma arrived and changed everything. The 37th floor was a testament to corporate success. Glass offices lined the perimeter, offering stunning views of the city skyline. The central area was an open workspace where young professionals in expensive clothing moved with the kind of energy that came from knowing their careers were on an upward trajectory. Everything was clean lines and modern furniture, the kind of environment Sarah had imagined herself working in when she'd graduated summa cum laude. With her master's degree in finance, A young man in a perfectly pressed shirt approached her with a clipboard. "Sarah Chen, I'm Marcus, Mr. Davidson's assistant. He's just finishing up a call. You can wait here." He gestured toward a sleek waiting area with low-backed chairs that looked more like art installations than actual furniture. Sarah settled carefully into one of the chairs, adjusting Emma's position in the carrier. The baby had dozed off during the elevator ride, her tiny features peaceful in sleep. Sarah allowed herself a moment to study her daughter's face. The way her dark eyelashes curved against her cheeks, the slight dimple in her chin that she'd inherited from Sarah's side of the family. Emma was the most beautiful thing that had ever happened to her, even if her rival had made everything else infinitely more complicated. The glass office at the end of the hallway was spacious and intimidating. Through the transparent walls, Sarah could see a man pacing behind an enormous desk, gesticulating as he spoke into a wireless headset. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Sarah's rent for 3 months. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and even from a distance, she could sense the kind of commanding presence that filled a room without effort. This was James Davidson, CEO of Sterling Industries, one of the most successful investment firms on the East Coast. Sarah had researched him extensively before the interview, reading every article she could find about his rise from a middle-class background to the pinnacle of the financial world. He was 34, just 8 years older than her, but he moved through the world with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in it. The conversation in his office seemed intense, with Davidson's voice rising and falling. In what appeared to be a heated discussion, Sarah caught fragments through the glass walls, something about quarterly projections and market volatility. His assistant Marcus glanced nervously at the office, then at Sarah, clearly calculating whether this was a good time for an interview. Emma shifted in her carrier, making a small sound that drew the attention of several nearby employees. Sarah noticed the looks, some curious, others disapproving. She understood their perspective. This was a serious business environment, not a place for babies and the complications they brought. But she also knew that she deserved to be here, that her qualifications spoke for themselves regardless of her current circumstances. The call in Davidson's office finally ended, and he emerged looking slightly frazzled but determined. Up close, he was even more imposing than Sarah had expected. His presence filled the hallway as he approached, and she found herself straightening in her chair, unconsciously preparing for what felt like an evaluation rather than a conversation. "Miss Chen," his voice was deep and measured, with the kind of authority that came from years of making decisions that affected hundreds of employees and millions of dollars. "I'm James Davidson. Thank you for coming in today." Sarah stood carefully, mindful of Emma's sleeping form. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me, Mr. Davidson. I know how valuable your time is." His eyes moved to the baby carrier, and for a moment, something unreadable flickered across his expression. "I wasn't aware you'd be bringing additional attendees to our meeting. I apologize for any confusion," Sarah replied, keeping her voice level. "I spoke with HR about the situation, and they indicated it would be acceptable for today's interview. My regular childcare arrangements fell through at the last minute." Davidson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He was clearly someone accustomed to controlled environments and predictable variables. A crying baby didn't fit into either category. "I see. Well, let's proceed to my office and see how this goes." The walk to his office felt longer than it actually was, with every step carrying the weight of Sarah's hopes and fears. She needed this job desperately. Her savings had dwindled to almost nothing, and the small unemployment checks barely covered rent and groceries, let alone Emma's growing needs. This position would change everything for them, providing not just financial stability, but the kind of career trajectory that could secure Emma's future. Davidson's office was even more impressive. From the inside, the walls were lined with awards and photographs of him with various business leaders and politicians. A bookshelf displayed an impressive collection of financial texts and business biographies. The desk was massive, made of what appeared to be solid mahogany, with a computer setup that probably cost more than Sarah's car. "Please have a seat," Davidson said, gesturing to one of two leather chairs positioned in front of his desk. The chairs were beautiful but clearly designed for aesthetics rather than comfort, especially for someone carrying a baby. Sarah settled into the chair as gracefully as possible, adjusting Emma's carrier to ensure she remained comfortable. The baby was still sleeping, her breathing slow and even, oblivious to the importance of this moment for both their futures. Davidson took his place behind the desk, opening a manila folder that Sarah assumed contained her resume and application materials. He studied the documents for a moment, his expression neutral but focused. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft sounds of Emma's breathing and the distant hum of the city below. "Your academic credentials are impressive," he began, his tone professional but not particularly warm. "Summa cum laude from Columbia, master's in finance with a focus on corporate analysis. Your professor's recommendations speak highly of your analytical abilities and attention to detail." "Thank you," Sarah replied. "I've always been passionate about financial analysis, particularly in understanding how market trends affect long-term corporate strategy. Your work experience, however, is somewhat limited," Davidson continued, flipping through the pages. "1 year at Meridian Accounting, which I see went out of business. Before that, various part-time positions during your studies." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. "Meridian was a small firm, but I gained valuable experience in corporate financial reporting and client relationship management. The company's closure was due to the owner's health issues and subsequent retirement, not performance-related problems." Davidson nodded absently, his attention seeming to drift between her words. "And the sleeping baby, and you've been unemployed for how long now?" "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." 6 months, Sarah admitted. "I've been actively searching for the right opportunity while also managing some personal responsibilities." She chose her words carefully, not wanting to make excuses, but also not wanting to lie about the challenges she'd faced. Emma stirred slightly in her carrier, making a soft murmuring sound that seemed unusually loud in the quiet office. Davidson's eyes moved immediately to the baby, and Sarah saw something in his expression that made her stomach clench with worry. "Miss Chen," he said, setting down her resume with a motion that felt deliberate and final, "I have to be honest with you. Sterling Industries is a high-pressure environment that demands absolute focus and availability from our analysts. We work long hours, often with little notice. Weekend work is common, as are late-night calls when markets are volatile." Sarah felt the interview slipping away from her, but she refused to give up without fighting for herself and Emma. "I understand the demands of the position, Mr. Davidson. My academic performance and work history demonstrate my ability to excel under pressure. I'm fully committed to contributing to Sterling Industries' continued success. But are you really?" Davidson leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. "Because from where I'm sitting, it appears you have priorities that might conflict with the level of dedication this position requires." The words stung, even though Sarah had expected them. She'd faced similar questions in other interviews. The unspoken assumption that being a mother automatically made her less capable or committed. "My daughter doesn't diminish my professional capabilities, Mr. Davidson. If anything, she's given me additional motivation to excel and build a stable future." Davidson's expression remained unchanged. "Miss Chen, I'm not questioning your motivation, but I am questioning your availability and your ability to prioritize the demands of this role when you clearly have other significant responsibilities." Emma chose that moment to wake up, her eyes opening slowly as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. She was usually calm after naps, content to observe the world around her, but something about the tension in the room seemed to affect her. She began to fuss, making small, unhappy sounds that quickly escalated toward a full cry. Sarah immediately began the practiced routine of soothing her daughter, gently bouncing the carrier and speaking in low, comforting tones. "SHH, sweetheart, it's okay. Mommy's here." She looked up at Davidson apologetically. "I'm sorry." She's usually much calmer than this. The change in environment has probably unsettled her. Davidson watched the scene with what appeared to be growing impatience. Emma's cries were becoming louder and more insistent, filling the office with sound that seemed to bounce off the glass walls and amplify. Other employees in the hallway were beginning to notice, their conversations pausing as they turned toward the source of the disturbance. "Perhaps we should reschedule this," Davidson said, his voice tight with barely contained frustration. "When you have more suitable arrangements, please, Mr. Davidson," Sarah said, still trying to calm Emma while maintaining her composure. "This isn't typical behavior for her. If I could just have a moment to Miss Chen." "I think it's clear that this situation isn't working for anyone involved," Davidson interrupted, standing up from his desk. "I have a board meeting in 15 minutes, and frankly, this level of disruption isn't acceptable." In a professional environment, Emma's cries had reached a pitch that made conversation nearly impossible. Sarah felt panic rising in her chest as she realized the interview was effectively over, and not in the way she had hoped. She stood up, still bouncing Emma and speaking soothingly, but nothing seemed to calm the baby down. "I understand your concerns," Sarah said, raising her voice slightly to be heard over Emma's cries. "But I want you to know that I'm fully capable of separating my personal and professional responsibilities. The situation today is exceptional, not representative of how I would perform in the role." Davidson moved around his desk, clearly intending to escort her out of his office. His expression had shifted from professional skepticism to obvious annoyance. "Miss Chen, I appreciate your time today, but I think it's best if we end this meeting here." As he approached, something unexpected happened. Emma, perhaps drawn to the movement or the deeper tone of his voice, suddenly stopped crying and turned her attention toward him. Her dark eyes, still bright with unshed tears, focused on his face with the kind of intense curiosity that babies reserve for new and interesting stimuli. Davidson paused, seemingly caught off guard by the sudden silence and the baby's direct gaze. Emma studied his face for a moment, then did something that surprised everyone in the room. She smiled. It was one of those radiant baby smiles that seemed to light up her entire face, the kind that made even strangers stop and smile back. For just a moment, Davidson's expression softened. As Emma drank her bottle, her dark eyes focused on Sarah's face with the kind of trust that was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. This little person depended on her completely, trusted her to provide everything from food and shelter to love and security. Sarah felt the weight of that responsibility keenly, especially in moments like this when the future felt uncertain and her ability to provide seemed inadequate. The apartment grew quiet except for the sounds of Emma drinking and the distant noise of traffic from the street below. Sarah's laptop sat on the kitchen table, surrounded by printed job listings and application materials. She would need to update her spreadsheet tonight, marking the Sterling Industries position as another rejection and moving on to the next possibility. The process had become depressingly routine. Research the company, tailor her resume and cover letter, submit the application, wait for a response that usually never came, and occasionally get called for an interview that led nowhere. Her bank statement lay unopened on the counter, but Sarah knew what it contained. The numbers had been declining steadily for months, and her unemployment benefits would end soon. She had savings from her time at Meridian, but Emma's needs seemed to grow daily: formula, diapers, clothes she was rapidly outgrowing, medical appointments, and all the hidden costs of raising a child that no one warned you about until you were living them. Emma finished her bottle and looked up at Sarah with sleepy satisfaction. Sarah lifted her to her shoulder for burping, a process that required patience and gentle persistence. As she patted Emma's back and waited, she found herself thinking about James Davidson and the way his expression had changed when Emma smiled at him. For just a moment, he had looked like a different person, someone capable of warmth and perhaps even understanding. But that moment had passed quickly, replaced by the professional distance that successful people maintain to protect themselves from the messy complications of real life. Sarah understood that distance, even if she didn't like it. In Davidson's position, she might make similar decisions, prioritizing organizational efficiency over individual circumstances. Emma's burp was small but satisfying, and Sarah laid her down in the portable crib that took up most of the living room's free space. The baby settled quickly, her eyelids growing heavy as she drifted toward sleep. Sarah watched her for a moment, marveling at how peaceful she looked despite the day's upheaval. Babies had the gift of living entirely in the present moment, untroubled by past disappointments or future worries. Sarah's phone rang, the sound sharp in the quiet apartment. She glanced at the caller ID and saw Mrs. Rodriguez's name. Her neighbor had probably been watching for her return, waiting for news about the interview. Sarah considered letting it go to voicemail, but Mrs. Rodriguez had been too kind and supportive to ignore. "Hello, Mrs. Rodriguez," Sarah answered, trying to inject some energy into her voice. "Mija, tell me everything. How did it go? Did they love you as much as I knew they would?" Sarah felt tears threatening again at the warmth in the older woman's voice. "It didn't go as well as I hoped," she admitted. "Emma had a difficult moment during the interview, and I think it affected their impression of my suitability for the position." Mija, I'm so sorry. But you know what? Their loss, any company that can't see how special you are doesn't deserve you. The fierce loyalty in Mrs. Rodriguez's voice was exactly what Sarah needed to hear, even if it didn't change her practical situation. "Thank you for saying that. And thank you again for lending me the blazer. I'll have it cleaned and return it tomorrow. You keep it as long as you need it, okay? For the next interview, and the one after that. Something good is coming for you, Sarah. I can feel it." After they hung up, Sarah sat in the growing darkness of her apartment, listening to Emma's peaceful breathing and trying to summon Mrs. Rodriguez's optimism. The older woman had lived through enough disappointments and setbacks to understand that good things didn't always come easily or quickly, but she maintained a faith in eventual justice that Sarah envied. The evening passed quietly. Sarah heated up leftover soup for dinner, fed Emma again, and spent some time reading to her from a board book about farm animals. Emma's favorite was the page with the cow, which always made her smile and reach toward the black and white illustration. These simple moments of connection felt precious, especially after a day that had reminded Sarah how precarious their situation really was. As night fell, Sarah prepared Emma for bed with the same careful routine they followed every evening. Bath time, fresh diaper, soft pajamas, and a final bottle while Sarah hummed the lullaby her mother had sung to her years ago. Emma's eyelids grew heavy as she drank, and soon she was sleeping peacefully in her crib. With Emma settled for the night, Sarah finally opened her laptop and began the process of updating her job search materials. She marked the Sterling Industries position as completed and unsuccessful, then scrolled through new listings that had been posted since morning. The market for financial analysts was competitive, with most positions requiring more experience than Sarah had accumulated in her brief career. Something in his features relaxed, and Sarah caught a glimpse of what he might have been like before years of corporate responsibility had hardened him into the intimidating figure before her. But the moment passed quickly, and his professional mask slipped back into place. "As I was saying," he continued, though his voice had lost some of its edge, "I think it's best if we conclude today's meeting." Sarah felt tears of frustration and disappointment threatening to spill over, but she refused to let them fall. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry, wouldn't give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break down. "I understand, Mr. Davidson. Thank you for your time." She began to gather her things, tucking her portfolio under her arm while adjusting Emma's carrier. The baby had settled back into contentment, apparently satisfied with her brief interaction with the intimidating man in the expensive suit. Sarah wished she could explain to Emma that their future had just become significantly more uncertain. But babies didn't understand concepts like unemployment benefits running out, or the growing stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen table. As Sarah prepared to leave, Davidson cleared his throat. "Miss Chen, before you go, I want to be clear about something. This decision isn't personal, and it's not a reflection on your qualifications or your potential as an analyst. It's simply a matter of fit with our current organizational needs." Sarah turned back to face him, Emma's weight of familiar comfort against her chest. "I appreciate the clarification, Mr. Davidson, but I hope you'll consider that my personal circumstances don't define my professional capabilities. I graduated at the top of my class. I have excellent references, and I'm willing to work harder than anyone else you might hire for this position." "I'm sure that's true," Davidson replied, but his tone suggested the conversation was over. "Marcus will show you out." The elevator ride down felt like a descent into failure. Sarah stared at her reflection in the mirrored walls, seeing a woman who had just watched another opportunity slip through her fingers. Emma gurgled contentedly, unaware that their carefully planned future had just been derailed by her perfectly natural behavior as a 6-month-old baby. The lobby seemed even more intimidating on the way out, filled with successful people who belonged in this world of marble and glass. Sarah felt like an intruder who had been discovered, and politely but firmly shown the door. The receptionist didn't look up from her computer as Sarah passed, but there was something in her deliberate focus that suggested she was aware of how the interview had gone. Outside, the rain had intensified, turning the afternoon into a study in gray and silver. Sarah stood under the building's awning, watching streams of water cascade from the edges while she processed what had just happened. She had prepared for difficult questions about her work history and her availability. She had not prepared for the reality of how quickly an interview could go from promising to disastrous. Emma was calm now, her earlier distress forgotten as she took in the sights and sounds of the busy street. Cars splashed through puddles, their headlights cutting through the gloom, while pedestrians hurried past under umbrellas and pulled up hoods. Sarah envied their sense of purpose, their ability to move through the world without carrying the weight of constant uncertainty. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Mrs. Rodriguez, her elderly neighbor who had loaned her the blazer. "How did it go, Mija?" Praying for good news, Sarah stared at the message, trying to figure out how to respond. Mrs. Rodriguez had been so excited about the interview, so hopeful that this would be the break Sarah needed. The thought of disappointing her felt almost as painful as the disappointment Sarah felt about her own situation. The subway ride home was a blur of fluorescent lights and rumbling tracks. Sarah found a seat near the back of the car, Emma dozing again in her carrier, and tried to process the events of the afternoon. She replayed every moment of the interview, wondering if there was something she could have done differently, some way she could have managed Emma's crying or convinced Davidson to look past the immediate disruption to see her potential. But even as she analyzed her performance, Sarah knew the fundamental problem wasn't anything she had said or done. The problem was a system that penalized women for having children, that saw motherhood as incompatible with professional ambition, that forced women to choose between career advancement and family responsibilities in ways that men never had to consider. The train pulled into her station, and Sarah gathered her things for the familiar walk home. Her neighborhood was a far cry from the gleaming towers of the financial district. The buildings were older, showing their age in chipped paint and worn stoops, but there was a warmth here that the corporate world lacked. Children played in small parks while their parents chatted on benches. Corner stores displayed handwritten signs in multiple languages. This was a community where people looked out for each other, where Mrs. Rodriguez could offer to loan a blazer and expect nothing in return except the hope that good things would happen to someone who deserved them. Sarah's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a pre-war building with thin walls and creaky floors. The elevator had been broken for 2 months, so she climbed the stairs carefully, mindful of Emma's carrier and her own fatigue. The hallway smelled of cooking spices and laundry, detergent, familiar scents that usually felt comforting, but today seemed to emphasize how far she was from the world she had just left. Inside her small 1-bedroom apartment, Sarah finally allowed herself to sink into the second-hand couch she had bought. When she first moved in, Emma was hungry now, making the small sounds that meant feeding time was approaching. Sarah prepared a bottle with practiced efficiency, the routine so familiar she could do it without thinking, which left her mind free to wander back to the interview and its disappointing conclusion. She spent an hour customizing cover letters and submitting applications, each one representing another hope that might or might not lead anywhere. The process was becoming mechanically familiar, but she forced herself to put genuine effort into each application, knowing that somewhere in the stack of possibilities might be the opportunity that would change Everything for her and Emma. Around 11 o'clock, Sarah finally closed the laptop and prepared for bed. She checked on Emma one more time, adjusting the light blanket and making sure the room temperature was comfortable. The baby slept with the profound stillness that only children possessed, completely trusting that tomorrow would bring everything she needed. Sarah wished she could share that confidence. As she lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the city settling into night, she found herself thinking again about the interview and James Davidson's reaction to Emma. There had been something in his expression during that brief moment when Emma smiled at him, something that suggested he wasn't entirely the cold corporate figure he presented to the world. But whatever humanity she had glimpsed in that moment hadn't been enough to overcome his concerns about her suitability for the position. Sarah understood his perspective, even if it frustrated her. From his viewpoint, she represented risk and unpredictability in an environment that valued control and consistency above all else. Sleep was slow to come, filled with fragments of the day's events and worries about tomorrow's challenges. Sarah found herself replaying conversations and wondering about different outcomes, the kind of circular thinking that solved nothing but felt necessary somehow. Eventually, exhaustion overcame anxiety, and she drifted into the fitful sleep of someone carrying too many responsibilities and not enough certainty about the future. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, a continuation of the previous day's weather that seemed to mirror Sarah's mood. Emma woke cheerful and energetic, ready to explore whatever the day might bring. Sarah envied her daughter's resilience, her ability to wake up optimistic regardless of yesterday's disappointments. As Sarah prepared Emma's morning bottle and got herself ready for another day of job searching, she tried to channel some of that optimism. The Sterling Industries interview had been a setback, but it wasn't the end of her story. There would be other opportunities, other chances to prove herself, other moments when the right combination of preparation and luck might align in her favor. She thought about Mrs. Rodriguez's unwavering faith that something good was coming, and she tried to hold on to that belief even when her practical mind cataloged all the reasons for pessimism. Emma deserved a mother who didn't give up, who continued fighting for their future even when the path forward seemed unclear. The day stretched ahead with its familiar routine of applications and follow-up calls, of managing Emma's needs while pursuing her own professional goals, of maintaining hope in the face of systematic barriers that made success more difficult for women in her situation. Sarah had learned to measure progress in small increments rather than dramatic breakthroughs, to celebrate minor victories while continuing to work toward larger goals. As she fed Emma and watched her daughter's face light up with simple pleasure at the taste of her morning bottle, Sarah felt her determination returning. The interview at Sterling Industries had been disappointing, but it had also been a learning experience. She had handled herself professionally under difficult circumstances, and she had gained valuable insight into the kinds of challenges she might face in similar situations. Emma finished her bottle and looked up at Sarah with bright, trusting eyes, as if to say that everything would work out exactly as it should. Sarah smiled back, drawing strength from her daughter's unwavering confidence in their future together. Whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced everything else, together, with determination and with the kind of love that made any sacrifice worthwhile. The morning was just beginning, and with it came new possibilities that Sarah couldn't yet imagine. Somewhere in the city, in offices and conference rooms she had never seen, decisions were being made that might affect her future in ways she couldn't predict. All she could do was continue moving forward, one application at a time, one interview at a time, one day at a time, trusting that persistence and preparation would eventually lead to the breakthrough she and Emma both deserved. The Sterling Industries executive boardroom occupied the entire 42nd floor, its walls lined with portraits of company founders and industry titans who had shaped the financial landscape over decades. James Davidson stood at the head of the mahogany conference table, his reflection multiplied in the polished surface as 23 board members settled into their leather chairs. The quarterly review meeting was running longer than anticipated, with heated discussions about market projections and strategic partnerships consuming most of the afternoon. The Morrison acquisition is moving forward as planned, Davidson reported, his voice carrying the authority that had made him the youngest CEO. In Sterling Industries' 90-year history, integration should be complete by the third quarter, with projected revenue increases of 12% annually. Board member Patricia Wells, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who had been with the company longer than Davidson had been alive, leaned forward in her chair. What about the personnel integration? The Morrison team has some excellent analysts who could strengthen our domestic division. We're reviewing all personnel carefully, Davidson replied, though his mind wandered momentarily to the failed interview earlier that day. Something about Sarah Chen's situation had stayed with him, an uncomfortable awareness that lingered despite his attempts to focus on more pressing matters. We'll retain the most qualified candidates and, unfortunately, have to let others go. As the meeting continued, Davidson found himself distracted by fragments of memory from the interview. The way Sarah had maintained her composure even as her situation deteriorated. The professional competence evident in her responses despite the chaos of a crying baby. Most unexpectedly, the moment when her daughter had looked directly at him, with those bright, curious eyes and smiled as if she could see something in him that he had forgotten existed. The boardroom discussion shifted to staffing challenges and the competitive market for top financial talent. We're having difficulty attracting experienced analysts, admitted Marcus Hoffman, the head of human resources. The compensation packages from tech companies are drawing people away from traditional finance roles. Then we need to think differently about our recruitment strategy, Davidson said, his attention snapping back to the present. Maybe we're being too narrow in our candidate profiles. Patricia Wells raised an eyebrow. What do you mean by that, James? Davidson paused, surprised by his own words. I mean, perhaps we should focus more on potential and capability, rather than checking boxes about experience and traditional career paths. Some of the best analysts are people who bring fresh perspectives precisely because they haven't been shaped by conventional industry thinking. The comment drew nods from several board members, though Davidson himself wasn't entirely sure where it had come from. He spent the remainder of the meeting contributing to discussions about market strategies and growth projections, but part of his mind remained occupied by questions he couldn't quite articulate about fairness and opportunity and the ways that personal circumstances could obscure professional potential. After the board members filed out, chatting among themselves about dinner plans and weekend strategies, Davidson remained in the empty conference room. The city sprawled beneath the floor-to-ceiling windows, millions of lights beginning to twinkle as evening approached. Somewhere in those lights was Sarah Chen, probably putting her daughter to bed and wondering how she would manage to keep searching for work while caring for a 6-month-old baby. Davidson's assistant Marcus appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand and expression slightly anxious. Mr. Davidson, there are a few items that need your attention before tomorrow morning. The Steinberg contract needs final approval, and legal wants to review the compliance protocols for the new trading algorithms. Handle the Steinberg contract, Davidson said without turning from the window. Schedule the legal review for Monday morning. And Marcus, pull the file on Sarah Chen from today's interview. Marcus hesitated, stylus hovering over his tablet. Sir, I thought that interview was concluded unsuccessfully. It was. I want to review her qualifications again. Of course, sir. I'll have it on your desk within the hour. Alone again. Davidson loosened his tie and allowed himself to acknowledge the discomfort that had been growing since the afternoon. He had built his career on making decisive judgments, quickly and sticking to them regardless of emotional considerations. It was a skill that had served him well in the cutthroat world of high finance, where sentiment could cost millions and second-guessing could destroy carefully constructed deals. But something about the Sarah Chen interview felt unfinished, like a calculation with variables he hadn't properly considered. He found himself thinking about the contrast between her obvious intelligence and her current circumstances, the way she had advocated for herself even as everything seemed to be going wrong, the glimpse of determination he had seen beneath her carefully maintained professional facade. Davidson's phone buzzed with a text from his younger sister Rachel. Dinner tomorrow? I have news to share." He smiled slightly, knowing that Rachel's news usually involved either a new boyfriend or a new cause she was passionate about supporting. She worked for a non-profit organization that provided career training for disadvantaged women, and their conversations often centered around her frustration with systemic barriers that kept talented people from reaching their potential. The irony wasn't lost on him that Rachel would probably have strong opinions about his handling of the Sarah Chen interview. She had always accused him of becoming too insulated by success, too removed from the struggles that ordinary people faced in trying to build stable lives for themselves and their families. "You live in a bubble, James," she had told him more than once. "You've forgotten what it's like to worry about paying rent or choosing between groceries and medication." Davidson had always defended himself by pointing to the responsibilities that came with his position, the hundreds of employees whose livelihoods depended on his ability to make sound business decisions, the shareholders who trusted him to generate returns on their investments. Personal sympathy, he argued, was a luxury he couldn't afford when so many people were counting on his objectivity and strategic thinking. But as he stood in the empty boardroom, watching the city lights grow brighter against the darkening sky, Davidson found himself questioning whether objectivity and compassion were really as incompatible as he had always assumed. Sarah Chen was clearly intelligent and well-qualified. Her academic credentials were impressive, her professors' recommendations enthusiastic, her test scores among the highest he had seen from recent candidates. The fact that she was a single mother shouldn't automatically disqualify her from consideration, especially when she had demonstrated her ability to manage multiple responsibilities. Throughout her educational and professional career, Davidson realized that his assumptions about her availability and dedication were based more on stereotypes than evidence, more on convenience than careful analysis. Marcus returned with Sarah's file, setting it carefully on the conference table before retreating to finish his end-of-day tasks. Davidson opened the folder and began reading more carefully than he had during the initial review. Sarah's academic record was stellar, with particular strength in areas that would be directly relevant to Sterling Industries' analytical needs. Her senior thesis had examined market volatility during periods of economic uncertainty, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of complex financial instruments and their behavioral implications. Her professor's letters of recommendation painted a picture of someone who was not only technically proficient, but also creative in her approach to problem solving. "Sarah brings fresh insights to traditional analytical frameworks," wrote Dr. Elizabeth Manning from Columbia's finance department. "She has an unusual ability to identify patterns that others miss, particularly in areas where quantitative analysis intersects with human behavioral factors." Another professor, Dr. Robert Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, had written extensively about Sarah's work ethic and leadership qualities. Despite managing significant personal challenges during her graduate studies, Sarah consistently produced work of the highest caliber. She often served as an informal mentor to struggling classmates, demonstrating both technical expertise and genuine concern for others' success. Davidson found himself wondering what those significant personal challenges had been. The timeline suggested that Sarah had been managing her pregnancy and early motherhood while completing her master's degree, which would have required extraordinary dedication and organizational skills. Far from indicating a lack of professional commitment, her academic achievements under those circumstances suggested someone with unusual resilience and determination. The more Davidson read, the more he recognized that his decision to end the interview had been hasty and perhaps unfair. Sarah's qualifications were strong enough to warrant serious consideration, and her personal circumstances, rather than being a liability, might actually indicate qualities that would be valuable in a demanding professional environment. His phone rang, interrupting his review of the file. The caller ID showed his sister Rachel's name, and Davidson answered with a mixture of anticipation and reluctance, knowing that she would somehow sense his current state of mind and ask probing questions he wasn't sure he wanted to answer. "James, you sound distracted," Rachel said without preamble. "Rough day at the office?" "Nothing unusual," Davidson replied, though he realized immediately that the response was more defensive than necessary. "What's this news you wanted to share? I'll get to that in a moment. First, tell me what's bothering you." You have that voice you get when you're questioning something you've already decided. Davidson sometimes forgot how well his sister knew him, how easily she could read his moods even over the phone. "I had an interview today that didn't go as smoothly as I expected. I'm wondering if I handled it fairly." Interesting. What kind of interview makes James Davidson question his legendary decisiveness? A woman with excellent qualifications, but complicated personal circumstances. She brought her baby to the interview because her childcare fell through, and I ended the meeting when the baby became disruptive. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough to make Davidson uncomfortable. When Rachel finally spoke, her voice carried a careful neutrality that was somehow more pointed than anger would have been. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly. A qualified candidate had a childcare emergency, brought her baby to an interview rather than missed the opportunity, and you ended the meeting because the baby acted like a baby? It's more complicated than that, Rachel. The office environment was clearly inappropriate for a baby, and the disruption made it impossible to conduct a proper interview. So did you offer to reschedule when she could make other arrangements?" Davidson realized with uncomfortable clarity that he had not made such an offer. The situation suggested that this kind of conflict between personal and professional responsibilities would be ongoing. "James," Rachel's voice carried the particular tone she used when she was trying to educate him about something she considered important. "Do you have any idea how difficult it must have been for her to bring her baby to that interview? How desperate she must have been for the opportunity? I understand that her situation is challenging." "No, I don't think you do. Understand, you're thinking about this from your position of security and options. You're not thinking about it from the perspective of someone who might be facing eviction or choosing between formula and electricity because she can't find work." Davidson felt a familiar irritation at his sister's tendency to assume the worst about his motivations. But beneath the irritation was an uncomfortable recognition that her perspective might contain more truth than he wanted to acknowledge. "I have responsibilities to the company and to our existing employees," he said. "I can't make hiring decisions based on sympathy for personal circumstances. I'm not asking you to hire her out of sympathy. I'm asking you to consider whether you gave her a fair chance to demonstrate her qualifications before you decided that her personal circumstances made her unsuitable." The question hung in the air between them, and Davidson found himself reviewing the interview from Rachel's perspective. Had he really given Sarah Chen a fair opportunity to present her case? Or had he made his decision the moment he saw the baby carrier? "What if I told you that this woman graduated summa cum laude from Columbia with a master's in finance?" Davidson said finally. "What if her professors described her as one of the most promising analysts they'd worked with? What if her test scores were in the top 5% of all candidates we've interviewed this year? Then I'd tell you that you probably made a mistake, and I'd ask you what you're planning to do about it." After they hung up, Davidson remained in the conference room as the building grew quiet around him. The cleaning staff had begun their evening rounds, and he could hear the distant sounds of vacuum cleaners and the soft conversations of people whose work began when the business day ended. He thought about the invisible army of workers who kept the corporate world functioning, people whose contributions were essential but often unrecognized, people whose personal struggles rarely intersected with the clean, efficient world of quarterly reports and strategic planning. Davidson opened Sarah's file again, this time paying attention to details he had glossed over during his initial review. Her address placed her in a neighborhood he was vaguely familiar with, a working-class area where young families often lived when they were starting out, but couldn't yet afford the suburbs. Her previous employer, Meridian Accounting, had been a small firm that specialized in serving local businesses and individual clients, rather than major corporations. The gap in her employment history corresponded exactly to the timeline when her daughter would have been born. Rather than seeing this as a red flag, Davidson began to recognize it as evidence of someone who had taken time to focus on her child's early development before returning to the workforce. Many of his colleagues talked about the importance of family values, but few of them had actually sacrificed career advancement for family responsibilities, the way Sarah apparently had. Davidson's own path to success had been relatively straightforward, marked by advantages he was only beginning to recognize as advantages, rather than simply the natural order of things. His parents had been able to support him through college, without requiring him to work, allowing him to focus entirely on his studies and internships. He had never faced the choice between attending a professional conference and staying home with a sick child, never had to decline a networking opportunity because he couldn't afford a babysitter. The more he considered Sarah's situation, the more he realized that her ability to maintain high academic performance while managing the responsibilities of single motherhood actually demonstrated exactly the kind of skills that would be valuable in a demanding professional environment: multitasking, crisis management, working under pressure, maintaining focus despite distractions. These were all qualities that Sterling Industries prized in its analysts. Davidson pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Dr. Elizabeth Manning's number. She had served as an external consultant on several Sterling Industries projects, and Davidson respected her judgment both as an academic and as someone who understood the practical demands of the financial industry. If anyone could give him an objective assessment of Sarah Chen's potential, it would be Dr. Manning. Elizabeth, this is James Davidson from Sterling Industries. I hope I'm not calling too late. James, good to hear from you. What can I do for you? I want to ask you about one of your former students, Sarah Chen. She interviewed for a position with us today, and I'm trying to get a better sense of her capabilities and potential. Sarah is exceptional, Dr. Manning said immediately. One of the most naturally gifted analysts I've worked with in 20 years of teaching. What specific aspects of her background are you interested in discussing? I'm particularly interested in her ability to handle pressure and manage multiple priorities. The position we're considering her for is quite demanding, and I want to make sure she's prepared for the challenges. Dr. Manning laughed, though not unkindly. James, Sarah Chen managed to produce graduate-level research while working to part-time jobs and raising a baby essentially on her own. If you're worried about her ability to handle pressure, I think you can put those concerns to rest. Can you tell me more about the quality of her work during that period? Her thesis was brilliant, but more importantly, her approach to problem solving was consistently innovative. She has a gift for seeing connections that others miss, for identifying the human elements in what might appear to be purely quantitative problems. In my experience, that kind of analytical intuition can't be taught. It's either there or it isn't, and Sarah definitely has it. What about her interpersonal skills? Her ability to work with colleagues and clients, outstanding. She was enormously popular with her classmates, not just because she was willing to help others, but because she had a way of explaining complex concepts that made them accessible. Without being condescending, she'd be an asset to any team. After ending the call, Davidson felt a growing sense that he had made an error in judgment that needed to be corrected. Sarah Chen's qualifications were strong enough to warrant serious consideration, and her personal circumstances, rather than being a liability, might actually be evidence of exactly the kind of character and resilience that Sterling Industries needed in its analysts. Davidson gathered Sarah's file and his briefcase, turning off the conference room lights as he prepared to leave the office. The building was quiet now except for the security guards and cleaning staff, people whose work continued after the executives and analysts had gone home to their comfortable apartments and suburban houses. As he waited for the elevator, Davidson found himself thinking about the different worlds that coexisted within the same city, the vast gaps between those who worried about stock options and those who worried about groceries. The drive home to his downtown loft usually provided time to decompress from the day's pressures, but tonight Davidson found himself taking a route that led through Sarah's neighborhood. He wasn't sure what he hoped to accomplish by seeing where she lived, but something compelled him to understand her world better before making a final decision about her candidacy. The neighborhood was exactly what he had expected based on her address: modest apartment buildings, interspersed with small businesses, tree-lined streets showing the wear of city life, but maintained with obvious community pride. Children played in small parks while their parents supervised from nearby benches, and the sidewalks showed the kind of foot traffic that indicated a place where people actually lived rather than simply slept between work days. Davidson drove slowly through the residential streets, observing the details that told the story of a community where people worked hard for modest security and took care of each other when circumstances became difficult. This was where Sarah Chen was raising her daughter, where she had managed to excel academically while building a foundation for their future together. As he turned toward his own neighborhood, Davidson found himself thinking about the conversation with his sister and Dr. Manning's enthusiastic endorsement of Sarah's capabilities. The evidence was mounting that his decision to end the interview had been premature and possibly unfair, based more on assumptions than actual assessment of her qualifications and potential. Davidson's loft occupied the top two floors of a converted warehouse in the Arts District, a space that had been featured in architectural magazines for its clean lines and impressive views of the city skyline. The monthly rent alone probably exceeded Sarah Chen's entire household budget, a fact that struck him with uncomfortable force as he pulled into his designated parking space. Inside his apartment, Davidson poured himself a glass of wine and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. Somewhere in the sprawl of lights and shadows, Sarah was probably putting her daughter to bed, perhaps reading her a story or singing a lullaby, creating the kind of intimate family moments that Davidson had always assumed he would experience. Someday, when his career reached a point where he could afford to focus on personal relationships, Davidson opened Sarah's file one more time, reading through her transcripts and recommendations with fresh attention to the details that revealed character as well as competence. Her undergraduate work had been completed while she was managing family responsibilities following her parents' death, yet her grades had remained consistently high. Her graduate research had been conducted during pregnancy and early motherhood, yet the quality of her analysis had impressed professors who were known for their exacting standards. The pattern was clear once Davidson allowed himself to see it. Sarah Chen was someone who delivered exceptional results regardless of personal challenges, someone who found ways to excel even when circumstances seemed to stack against her. These were exactly the qualities that Sterling Industries needed in its analysts, people who could maintain focus and produce quality work even when markets were volatile and pressures were intense. Davidson realized that his concerns about Sarah's availability and dedication had been based on stereotypes rather than evidence, assumptions about working mothers that reflected his own limited experience, rather than careful analysis of her actual track record. A woman who had managed to excel academically while raising a child was likely to bring unusual focus and efficiency to any professional challenge. The question now was what to do with this recognition. The interview had ended badly, with Sarah clearly understanding that she had been rejected because of her circumstances rather than her qualifications. Davidson couldn't simply call her back and pretend that the afternoon's events hadn't happened, couldn't erase the impression that Sterling Industries was the kind of company that penalized women for having children, but he could acknowledge his error and give her the fair consideration that her qualifications deserved. He could demonstrate that Sterling Industries was capable of looking beyond surface circumstances to recognize genuine talent and potential. Most importantly, he could show Sarah Chen that not all doors were closed to her, that someone was willing to bet on her ability to succeed despite the challenges she faced. Davidson spent the evening researching best practices for supporting working parents, reading about companies that had found ways to accommodate family responsibilities without sacrificing professional standards. The solutions weren't complicated: flexible scheduling, remote work options, backup childcare assistance, and most importantly, a culture that judged employees by their results rather than their presence in the office during traditional hours. As midnight approached, Davidson made a decision that surprised him with its clarity and certainty. He would call Sarah Chen in the morning and invite her back for a second interview. one conducted under circumstances that would allow her to demonstrate her capabilities. Without the distraction of managing her daughter's needs, he would approach the conversation as what it should have been from the beginning, a professional assessment of a qualified candidate's potential contribution to Sterling Industries' continued success. Davidson's last thought before falling asleep was about the moment during the interview when Sarah's daughter had looked directly at him and smiled, as if she could see something in him that he had temporarily forgotten about himself. Perhaps children had a gift for recognizing potential in people, for seeing past the protective barriers that adults built around their hearts, and finding the humanity that professional success sometimes obscured. Tomorrow would bring an opportunity to correct his mistake and give Sarah Chen the fair consideration she deserved. More importantly, it would be a chance for Davidson to demonstrate that success and compassion weren't mutually exclusive, that the best business decisions were often the ones that recognized the full humanity of the people behind the resumes and credentials. The city continued its restless sleep outside his windows, millions of people dreaming their own dreams of security and opportunity and recognition. Among them was a young mother who had faced disappointment with grace and dignity, who would wake up tomorrow morning and continue her search for the chance to build a better future for herself and her daughter. Davidson fell asleep determined to make sure that tomorrow would bring different news than Sarah Chen was expecting, that sometimes the world did offer second chances to people who deserve them, and that occasionally the powerful chose to use their position to open doors rather than close them. Sarah's phone rang at 7:45 in the morning. Cutting through the quiet routine of preparing Emma's breakfast, the caller ID showed an unfamiliar number with a local area code, and Sarah hesitated before answering. Experience had taught her that unexpected calls rarely brought good news, especially when they came early enough to suggest urgency or importance. "This is Sarah Chen," she answered cautiously, balancing the phone against her shoulder while continuing to warm Emma's bottle. "Miss Chen, this is Marcus Williams from Sterling Industries. Mr. Davidson would like to speak with you regarding yesterday's interview. Would you be available to take his call?" Sarah's stomach dropped. A follow-up call the morning after a disastrous interview could only mean one thing. They wanted to make their rejection official, perhaps to clarify that her behavior had been unprofessional or to ensure she understood why she wouldn't be considered for future positions. Of course, Sarah managed, though her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "I can speak with him now. Please hold while I transfer you." The hold music was classical and soothing, designed to calm nervous candidates and busy executives alike. Sarah used the brief interval to test Emma's bottle temperature and settle her daughter in the high chair she had bought secondhand from a neighbor. Emma babbled contentedly, unaware that her mother's future might be determined by whatever conversation was about to unfold. "Miss Chen, thank you for taking my call." James Davidson's voice carried the same authority it had possessed during the interview, but something in his tone suggested a different purpose than she had expected. "I want to discuss yesterday's meeting and explore the possibility of continuing our conversation under different circumstances." Sarah blinked, certain she had misunderstood. "I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?" "I'd like to invite you back for a second interview. Yesterday's circumstances weren't conducive to a proper evaluation of your qualifications, and I believe you deserve a fair opportunity to present your capabilities." The words hung in the air while Sarah processed their implications. She had prepared herself for rejection, for criticism, for the familiar sting of doors closing before she had a chance to prove herself. She had not prepared for this. "Mr. Davidson, I appreciate the offer, but I want to be completely transparent. My childcare situation hasn't changed. If my daughter becomes ill or my babysitter cancels again, I could face the same challenges that disrupted yesterday's meeting. I understand that, and I've given considerable thought to how we might address those concerns. Would you be available to meet this afternoon at 2 o'clock? I'd like to propose some alternative arrangements that might work better for both of us." Sarah glanced at Emma, who was methodically dropping pieces of banana from her high chair to the floor while studying the physics of gravity with intense concentration. Mrs. Rodriguez had already agreed to watch Emma for a few hours if another interview opportunity rose, and Sarah knew her neighbor would be thrilled to learn that someone had given her a second chance. "Yes, I can be there at 2 o'clock. Should I bring any additional materials or documentation?" "Just bring yourself and whatever questions you might have about the position or the company. I look forward to our conversation." After hanging up, Sarah stood in her small kitchen, trying to process what had just happened. James Davidson had seemed genuinely interested in giving her another opportunity, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this might be some kind of test or formality. Before delivering the inevitable rejection, corporate executives didn't usually offer second chances out of kindness. There had to be some practical motivation she wasn't seeing. Emma had finished her scientific exploration of gravity and was now demanding attention with the specific sounds that meant she wanted to be picked up and entertained. Sarah lifted her daughter from the high chair, holding her close while Emma's tiny hands explored the fabric of her shirt and the texture of her hair. "What do you think, sweetheart?" Sarah murmured. "Should mommy trust that maybe things could work out differently this time?" Emma responded with a cheerful babble that Sarah chose to interpret as encouragement. Her daughter had an infinite capacity for optimism, approaching each day as if it held unlimited possibilities for discovery and joy. Sarah envied that perspective, even as she tried to cultivate some version of it in herself. The hours until the interview passed slowly, filled with the usual routines of caring for Emma while managing the persistent anxiety that accompanied any professional opportunity. Sarah reviewed her notes about Sterling Industries, refreshed her memory of recent market trends that might come up in conversation, and tried to anticipate what Davidson might want to discuss. During their second meeting, Mrs. Rodriguez arrived promptly at 1 o'clock, bringing homemade cookies and the kind of warm enthusiasm that made Sarah feel temporarily less alone in the world. The elderly woman had raised 4 children of her own and possessed an intuitive understanding of babies that allowed Emma to settle comfortably in her care within minutes. "You look beautiful, Mija," Mrs. Rodriguez said, adjusting the collar of Sarah's blazer with maternal attention. "But more importantly, you look strong. Whatever happens today, you'll handle it with grace." Sarah took the subway into the financial district, watching the familiar landmarks pass by while trying to manage her expectations. The morning's call had been encouraging, but she had learned not to invest too much hope in situations that could change quickly and unexpectedly. Better to approach the interview with cautious optimism than to risk the devastating disappointment that came from believing too strongly in outcomes beyond her control. The Sterling Industries lobby looked exactly as imposing as it had the day before, all marble and glass, and the subtle intimidation that came from obvious wealth and power. But something felt different as Sarah approached the reception desk, perhaps because she was no longer carrying Emma, or perhaps because her perspective had shifted in ways she didn't fully understand. The same receptionist was working, and she looked up from her computer with an expression that seemed marginally warmer than it had been during Sarah's previous visit. "Sarah Chen for the 2 o'clock appointment with Mr. Davidson." "Yes, that's correct. Mr. Williams will be down to escort you upstairs. Can I offer you anything while you wait?" "Coffee, water, tea?" Sarah accepted a bottle of water and settled into one of the lobby's modern chairs, noting that the absence of Emma's carrier made the experience significantly more comfortable. She used the few minutes to review her talking points one final time and to practice the kind of deep breathing that helped manage pre-interview nerves. Marcus Williams appeared exactly on time, greeting Sarah with a professional smile that seemed genuinely welcoming rather than merely polite. "Miss Chen, thank you for coming back. Mr. Davidson is looking forward to continuing your conversation." The elevator ride to the 37th floor passed in comfortable silence, and Sarah noticed that Marcus seemed less tense than he had during her previous visit. Whatever had prompted Davidson to invite her back had apparently been communicated to his staff as a positive development rather than a necessary formality. "Mr. Davidson is waiting in conference room B rather than his office," Marcus explained as they walked through the open works pace area. He thought a more neutral setting might be conducive to a better conversation. Conference room B was smaller and less intimidating than Davidson's office, with a round table that suggested collaboration rather than hierarchy and windows that offered a pleasant view of the city without overwhelming the space. Davidson was already seated at the table, wearing a navy suit that was perfectly tailored but somehow seemed less armor-like than his previous outfit. "Miss Chen, please have a seat wherever you're comfortable." Davidson's greeting was warmer than she remembered, and he waited for her to settle before taking his own seat across from her. "Thank you for being willing to give us another chance. I want to begin by acknowledging that yesterday's interview didn't go as well as either of us had hoped, and I take responsibility for that." Sarah was surprised by the directness of his statement. "I appreciate that, Mr. Davidson. I understand that bringing Emma wasn't ideal, but it was my only option given the circumstances. Which brings me to the reason I wanted to meet again. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I realized that I made some assumptions about your situation that weren't fair or accurate. I'd like to start over and focus on what really matters: your qualifications and your potential contribution to our team." Sarah felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to relax. "I'd welcome that opportunity." Davidson opened a folder that contained what appeared to be her resume and application materials, but he didn't immediately reference them. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair and studied her with an expression that seemed genuinely curious rather than evaluative. "Tell me about your thesis research," he said. "I've read the abstract, but I'd like to hear your perspective on why you chose that particular focus and what you discovered that surprised you." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah found herself engaged in the kind of substantive professional conversation she had been hoping for since she began her job search. Davidson asked thoughtful questions about her analytical methods, her conclusions about market behavior during periods of uncertainty, and her ideas about how academic research could be applied to practical investment strategies. Sarah felt her confidence returning as she discussed work that she was genuinely passionate about. Her research had examined the intersection of quantitative analysis and behavioral psychology in financial markets, exploring how human emotions and biases affected supposedly rational economic decisions. It was exactly the kind of interdisciplinary thinking that modern financial firms needed, but often struggled to integrate into their traditional analytical frameworks. "Your research suggests that emotional factors play a larger role in market volatility than most analysts acknowledge," Davidson observed. "How would you apply that insight to actual investment decisions?" "I think the key is developing analytical models that account for human behavior as a legitimate variable rather than treating it as noise in the data," Sarah replied. "Markets are made up of people, and people don't always act rationally, especially during periods of stress or uncertainty. If we can identify and measure those behavioral patterns, we can make better predictions about market movements." Davidson nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need here. Traditional analytical approaches are becoming less effective as markets become more complex and interconnected. We need people who can see patterns that others miss." The conversation continued for another hour, covering topics ranging from Sarah's academic background to her ideas about emerging trends in financial technology. Davidson asked about her experience with specific analytical software, her approach to working with clients, and her thoughts about the ethical responsibilities of financial professionals. Throughout the discussion, Sarah noticed that Davidson seemed genuinely engaged with her responses, asking follow-up questions that suggested he was really listening rather than simply going through the motions of a formal interview. His questions were challenging but fair, designed to explore her thinking rather than trap her in contradictions or expose weaknesses. "I have one more question," Davidson said as the formal portion of the interview began to wind down. "Yesterday's situation with your daughter raised some practical concerns about scheduling and availability. How would you handle the demands of this position while managing your responsibilities as a single mother?" Sarah had anticipated this question and had prepared a thoughtful response. "I understand that this is a demanding role that requires flexibility and dedication. I've been managing multiple responsibilities for several years now, and I've developed systems and support networks that allow me to meet my commitments reliably. When I was completing my graduate degree while caring for Emma, I never missed a deadline or failed to deliver quality work. What kind of support systems? I have reliable childcare arrangements through a licensed provider in my neighborhood, and my neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez is available for backup coverage when needed. I also have excellent time management skills and I am comfortable working efficiently during non-traditional hours when necessary. Davidson leaned forward slightly. What I'm really asking is whether you believe you can give this position the attention it requires. The analysts who succeed here are completely committed to excellence, and they're willing to prioritize work demands when situations require it. Sarah met his gaze directly. Mr. Davidson, my daughter motivates me to work harder, not less hard. She's the reason I need to succeed, and she's also the reason I can't afford to deliver anything less than my best effort. Being a mother has made me more efficient, more focused, and more determined than I was before. It hasn't diminished my professional capabilities, it's enhanced them. The sincerity in her voice seemed to resonate with Davidson, who nodded slowly. As he processed her response, I believe that's true. In fact, I've done some additional research since yesterday, and everything I've learned confirms that you have exactly the qualities we're looking for in a senior analyst. Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate as she recognized that the interview was moving toward some kind of conclusion. I appreciate you taking the time to reconsider my candidacy, Miss Chen. I'd like to offer you the position. The words hung in the air between them, and Sarah found herself momentarily speechless. She had hoped for this outcome, but hadn't quite allowed herself to believe it was possible, especially after yesterday's disaster. I'm very interested in accepting, she managed. Could you tell me more about the specific responsibilities and the timeline for starting? Davidson smiled, and Sarah realized it was the first time she had seen him look genuinely pleased rather than professionally cordial. You'd be working primarily with our domestic equity team, conducting analysis on mid-cap growth companies and emerging market sectors. The position includes a competitive salary, full benefits, and opportunities for advancement based on performance. They spent the next few minutes discussing practical details, start date, training schedule, office logistics, and the team structure Sarah would be joining. Davidson also explained Sterling Industries' policies regarding flexible work arrangements, which included options for remote work when circumstances required it and support for employees managing family responsibilities. I want to be clear about something, Davidson said as their meeting began to conclude. Yesterday's interview ended poorly because I made unfair assumptions about your situation. Today's offer is based entirely on your qualifications and your potential to contribute to our success. You've earned this opportunity through your academic achievements, your analytical skills, and your demonstrated ability to excel under challenging circumstances. Sarah felt tears threatening, but managed to maintain her composure. Thank you for giving me a fair chance to prove myself. I won't disappoint you. I don't believe you will. In fact, I think you're going to surprise a lot of people here with what you're capable of accomplishing. As Sarah prepared to leave, Davidson walked her to the elevator, chatting casually about the neighborhood where the office was located and the restaurants where team members often grabbed lunch. The conversation felt natural and comfortable, so different from the stilted formality of yesterday's interaction. I have one last question, Sarah said as they waited for the elevator to arrive. What made you decide to give me another chance? Most people in your position wouldn't have bothered to reconsider after yesterday's difficulties. Davidson was quiet for a moment, as if considering how much to reveal. Someone reminded me that the best business decisions are often the ones that recognize the full potential of the people behind the resumes. I realized that I had been looking at your circumstances instead of your capabilities, and that's not the kind of leader I want to be. The elevator arrived, and Sarah stepped inside, turning to face Davidson as the doors began to close. Thank you for seeing past the surface circumstances to recognize what I could contribute. I'm looking forward to proving that your faith in me was justified. As the elevator descended, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and overwhelming relief that was almost dizzying in its intensity. She had a job, a real job with a reputable company, doing work that she was genuinely excited about, earning a salary that would allow her to provide Emma with the stability and security they both needed. The lobby seemed different as Sarah walked through it, less intimidating and more welcoming. The marble floors and glass walls no longer felt like barriers designed to exclude people like her. They felt like the foundation of a place where she belonged, where her contributions would be valued and her potential recognized. Outside, the afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds that had dominated the sky for the past few days. Sarah stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the warmth touch her face while she processed everything that had just happened. 6 months of rejections and disappointments had culminated in this moment of validation and opportunity. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Rodriguez. "How did it go, Mija? Emma is being an angel, but she misses her mama." Sarah smiled as she typed her response. "I got the job. Coming home now to celebrate with both of you." The subway ride back to her neighborhood passed in a blur of gratitude and disbelief. Sarah found herself reviewing the conversation with Davidson, marveling at how different the second interview had been from the first. He had been genuinely interested in her ideas, respectful of her situation, and clear about his decision to judge her on her merits rather than her circumstances. Sarah thought about the moment when Davidson had acknowledged his error in judgment from the previous day. It took character for someone in his position to admit mistakes and take responsibility for unfair treatment. Most executives would have simply moved on to other candidates rather than questioning their own assumptions and biases. As the train pulled into her station, Sarah realized that she was not just gaining employment, but joining an organization led by someone who was willing to challenge his own preconceptions and make decisions based on fairness rather than convenience. That kind of leadership was rare in any industry, and particularly valuable in the competitive world of finance where expediency often trumped ethics. Mrs. Rodriguez was waiting at the door when Sarah arrived, Emma perched on her hip and babbling excitedly at the sight of her mother. The older woman's face lit up as she saw Sarah's expression, reading the good news before any words were spoken. "Mija, you got it. I can see it in your face." Sarah nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the emotion she had been holding back during the professional conversation. "I start Monday morning, full-time, with benefits, doing exactly the kind of work I've been hoping for." Mrs. Rodriguez handed Emma to Sarah and immediately enveloped them both in a warm hug that smelled of vanilla and cinnamon. "I told you something good was coming. The universe doesn't forget people who work as hard as you do." Emma seemed to sense the celebratory mood, reaching up to touch Sarah's face with tiny hands while babbling in the special language that mothers and babies shared. Sarah held her daughter close, breathing in the familiar scent of baby shampoo and thinking about how different their future looked now than it had just a few hours ago. That evening, Sarah called her parents' best friends, the Johnsons, who had remained close to her after the accident and had served as surrogate grandparents to Emma. Mrs. Johnson cried with joy over the phone, while Mr. Johnson gruffly declared that any company smart enough to hire Sarah was probably a good investment opportunity. Sarah spent the night making practical preparations for her new position, researching the Sterling Industries team she would be joining, organizing her wardrobe to ensure she had appropriate professional clothing, and arranging the childcare schedule that would allow her to maintain consistent work hours. But beneath the practical planning was a deeper sense of transformation that went beyond simple employment. For months, Sarah had felt invisible to the professional world, reduced to a collection of circumstances that seemed to disqualify her from consideration. Regardless of her capabilities, Davidson's decision to look past those circumstances and recognize her potential felt like a validation of everything she had worked toward. As Sarah prepared for bed, she checked on Emma one last time, watching her daughter sleep with the peaceful confidence that came from knowing she was loved and safe. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but for the first time in months, Sarah felt optimistic about their ability to build the kind of stable, secure life she had always wanted to provide. Emma stirred slightly in her sleep, making the soft sounds that meant she was dreaming. Sarah wondered what babies dreamed about, whether Emma's unconscious mind was filled with colors and textures, and the comforting presence of people who loved her. Sarah hoped that as Emma grew older, she would remember these early years not as a time of struggle and uncertainty, but as proof that people who cared about each other could overcome challenges together. The apartment felt different as Sarah turned off the lights and settled into her own bed. The same small rooms and secondhand furniture, but somehow transformed by the knowledge that tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new chapter. In their lives, Sarah fell asleep thinking about the moment when Davidson had smiled and offered her the position, the recognition that her perseverance had finally led to the opportunity she deserved. Outside, the city continued its restless rhythm, millions of people pursuing their own dreams of success and security. Among them were other single mothers facing similar challenges, other qualified candidates being overlooked because of circumstances beyond their control, other talented individuals waiting for someone to recognize their potential. Sarah hoped that her story would somehow contribute to a world where those recognitions came more easily, and more often, where people were judged by their capabilities rather than their situations. Monday morning would bring the start of her new career at Sterling Industries, working alongside colleagues who had been chosen for their analytical skills and professional dedication. Sarah was ready to prove that she belonged among them, that her unique perspective and hard-earned resilience would make her a valuable addition to their team. But tonight, she simply held onto the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the world did offer second chances, that occasionally the powerful chose to use their positions to open doors rather than close them, and that persistence and preparation could eventually overcome even the most discouraging circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight was for gratitude and hope and the peaceful sleep that came from knowing the future looked brighter than it had in a very long time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.